Very good to be with you. My name is Rain Paulson. I work with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations as the Director of Emergencies and Resilience. Pleasure to be with you. We have, I think, a very interesting topic for discussion today, and I hope it will be a discussion. We're going to have some panelists, some online contributions, but I hope we'll have plenty of time for some exchanges based in all of your experience on this key question around how can we improve the way we're managing food crises? How can we manage food crises differently? And I'll get into some of the scene-setting comments in a second, but just at the outset, let me introduce the colleagues that are going to be supporting our discussions today. So we have one panelist with us here in the room, we have two panelists online, and we have a video contribution from our final panelists. So let me start first to introduce Charlotte Fontaine, thematic expert on food security with DG ECHO. Online we have Racy Henderson, who works with the Seeds project and is the coordinator of the Support Crop-Related Livelihoods and Emergencies project, the Seeds project. And we also have Mahmoud Douale, Executive Director, Rural Agency for Community Development and Assistance, RACIDA. We also, as I mentioned, have a video contribution from Mr. Habib Ur Rahman Mayer, who is the Deputy General Secretary of the G7+, who will speak to us as well. So we're very much looking forward to today's discussion. We have a focused hour in which to cover through these issues, and I'm really looking forward to seeing also what reflections each of you have as we get into some of this substance. So hopefully if you've come to this session, you've obviously seen the background, you've seen the concept note, and indeed as we've been listening in the plenary sessions, in the discussions, in the side meetings, we're facing a challenging, complex, evolving environment. And before we get into some of the details on the discussion, let me just share a few reflections to scene set and to guide our discussions. One of the initiatives that FAO engages in with strong support from the European Union, WFP and other partners is something that's called the Global Network Against Food Crises. I'm not sure how many of you have come across the Global Network. You may, if you haven't have heard of the network, you may have heard about one of the flagship products that the network produces, which is the Global Report Against Food Crises. And the Global Report Against Food Crisis on an annual basis captures and consolidates details around the number of people that are affected by acute food insecurity. Of course, the inputs from this come from many of your organizations, draws heavily on the gold standard analysis that's done by the integrated phase classification system, by the Cadre Harmonisé in the Sahel and parts of West Africa. And the latest numbers from last year, the latest update from September last year, talked about at least 222 million people in acute food insecurity in IPC 3+. If we go back to the beginning of these annual reports on global food crisis, the very first one was done in 2016, and at that stage, the number was 108 million people in IPC 3+. And what we've seen consistently over the years, tragically, unfortunately, is that not only have the absolute numbers of people in acute food insecurity grown, but the prevalence, the percentage of the populations in countries has also increased, right? And if we didn't need external numbers to tell us what we probably all know in ourselves as humanitarian practitioners, the situation in terms of acute food insecurity is getting worse year on year. So that may be an obvious reality, a reality that's familiar to all of us. But thinking through then how we use our emergency tools and emergency approaches to maximum effect becomes a really compelling and even an ethical question, right? So let's recall that, unlike the responses that are being mounted now to the tragedies of the earthquake that recently struck Turkey, that impacted people in Turkey and Syria, for which a flash appeal has been launched, which I hope gets all the support it needs. Unlike those types of disaster-related events, most of these 222 million people in acute food insecurity find themselves in contexts where we have been mounting humanitarian operations year after year after year for a succession of years. Right? Again, all of the contexts are different. All of them require their context-specific solutions, right? And when we get into some of the conversations around agriculture, we know that we need to, no one is a generic person, right? We need to be grounded in their realities, their rhythm of creating livelihoods for themselves, those context-specific issues that should determine our response. But there is a common characteristic, which is the protracted nature of this acute food insecurity, right? So there are contradictions here. We're talking about protracted crises, but acute food insecurity. So in a context in which we're struggling to mobilize the right amount of attention, I mean, let's recall that the Global Humanitarian Overview launched at the end of last year was asking for an excess of $51 billion, right? I mean, really, really unprecedented amounts. And now already, I think we're in excess of 54 billion US dollars that's being requested to respond to these populations. What is it that we can do differently? How can we evolve our approaches? Are there things that we can do differently that allow us to be more impactful in our response, that allow us to be more effective in our programming approaches, and importantly, allow us to use humanitarian response to the full extent possible, also to address some of the root causes that are driving food insecurity? I know these can get into quite complex and sensitive discussions, but fundamentally, the numbers tell us that we need to look at different ways to manage acute food crisis. So, this conversation around how can we respond in the most effective way possible using our humanitarian tools in a way which gives the best opportunity for breaking this cycle of protracted acute food insecurity. So this question around how we can do better with humanitarian response is something that I know each of our organizations has been grappling with. It's certainly something that we in the FAO have been grappling with as well, wrestling with. Finding a way then to use the right tools to have greater impact is really the thing on which we want to focus. I shared the names of the presenters and the panelists. I should have also said that we'll have an opportunity to look both at a short video and also at a presentation of 4 slides, which will also share, I think, some interesting analysis that's come out of the global network, which talks about funding trends and how those funding trends have matched or not what's happening in terms of acute food insecurity trends. And I hope these things will trigger some questions and some discussions amongst ourselves in terms of where we go from here to have a greater impact on the humanitarian caseload. You won't be surprised to hear that from FAO's perspective, we feel strongly that the evidence bears out the fact that agriculture can have a transformative impact also in humanitarian context, maybe especially in humanitarian context. When we look at the numbers of people in need of assistance, and I've already given the numbers of people in acute food insecurity, but if we look at the caseload in the global humanitarian overview, the people in need of assistance globally, the estimates are that 80% of that total population are people living in rural communities. People connected to agriculture, right? Farmers or fisherfolk or pastoralists, right? And before they became an IDP or before they were forced to flee across borders and become a refugee, many of them, in fact a majority of them, had an experience grounded in rural livelihoods. And so these questions around how we use also that as a starting point for the types of interventions that should be mounted to respond to acute food insecurity, I think is a very interesting one. Let me maybe give a couple of examples. I could, as you can tell, sit here and talk for an hour, which certainly isn't my intention. We have just an hour for a panel discussion. But let me give a couple of examples, recent examples, one from Tigray and one from Afghanistan, which speak to the way in which time-sensitive agricultural interventions can have a huge impact within an integrated multi-sectoral humanitarian response. Tigray, of course, you're all well familiar with the tragedy and the context. You'll probably recall that this was the part of Ethiopia in which we had at one point in time the largest population that was estimated to be in IPC phase 5, right, of any country globally. Blockades were impacting an ability for the international community to support and respond. Life-saving assistance was desperately needed. You may recall all of the discussions and the focus, maybe not all of you were working on that part of the humanitarian response at this stage, but the focus on access, right, on trucks being able to make it into Tigray to support this war-affected population who were in an IPC 5 population phase. So the estimates were that from the uptick in the fighting in August 2021 to the 7-8 months after that, the international community was able to move approximately 200,000 metric tons of food commodity into Tigray, which without a doubt had a huge impact in stemming what would have been an even worse catastrophe. What's very interesting to note at the same time, during this same period when blockades were making it difficult to access and when 200,000 metric tons of food commodity came in, that local actors, farmers, including those supported by FAO, perhaps also supported by your organizations, inside Tigray, in a situation of conflict, during that same period produced 900,000 metric tons of food for local consumption. This is estimated at being about 7 months of the food requirements of the entire population in Tigray. Interesting questions to be asked around how we use this, how we understand this in a context of trying to have the most cost-effective responses, the most appropriate mix of activities, and how we can fully take advantage of people's own agency, even in the most extreme settings, right? So let's recall, blockaded environment, active conflict, IPC 5 population. Afghanistan. Another simple example to use there. So in a context where we have also a growing population in IPC 3+, I think the latest numbers are 19.9 million people in Afghanistan in IPC 3+, right? Huge both humanitarian catastrophe and food security catastrophe. The winter wheat campaign, a $220 intervention, allowed a family of 7 to produce their cereal requirements for a 12-month period and a surplus for sale. Right? And in those same communities, if that family had to purchase flour on the markets, if that flour was available and if they had the money to buy it, would have cost about 4 times as much. And if the situation was such that we collectively were obligated to provide in-kind international food assistance to support that same family in the absence of other interventions, that would have cost 9 to 10 times as much, right? So it's not that agriculture is the answer everywhere, in every context, but in protracted crisis context, we can get into some interesting conversations around whether we have the mix right, and if there are some new ways of working, some different ways of working. And when we come to the slide presentation later on funding flows and funding analysis, it'd be interesting to have some reflections on those pieces. We all know that any kind of meaningful response to acute humanitarian need, and here I'm talking about the food security dimensions of that, requires multi-sectoral responses, integrated responses, right? You'd need, at the right point in time, in-kind assistance, cash assistance, the right types of water and sanitations. You absolutely need time-sensitive nutrition interventions. Our point is that we have some opportunities that are not fully realized when it comes to the role that time-sensitive agriculture can play in that space as well. And there could be some transformative questions and opportunities to have there. So that's a little bit of the backdrop, and I'm not a very good poker player because I've already showed my cards quite openly in terms of some of the aspects of the discussion I hope we can touch on today. But let's start with a short video, then we'll have a presentation, and then we're going to move on to some reflections from the panelists that I earlier introduced. So if we could run the video, please.
Have you ever wondered why, in this day and age, some communities constantly face extreme hunger? There's a common saying that goes, give a person a fish and they will have dinner for the night, but teach them to fish and they'll never have to worry about food again. It sounds easy enough, but what happens in the event of a disaster? Like if the lake dries up? Nearly 80% of the people on our planet live in rural areas and rely on some form of agricultural production for their livelihoods. Floods, droughts, conflict, pandemics, these types of disasters can have massive impacts, not only on fields and crops, but also on agricultural assets and infrastructure, leaving people's livelihoods in tatters and leaving rural communities even more vulnerable. In fact, just one planting season or harvest can change their lives forever. This is why emergency livelihoods assistance is so important as a frontline humanitarian intervention. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations is on the ground, helping communities to anticipate disasters, responding with life-saving aid when disasters strike, and helping affected families and communities move towards a lasting recovery. Emergency food assistance is vital, but we must do more to win the battle against hunger. Building livelihoods and agri-food systems that are resilient to shocks are at the core of FAO's humanitarian work. Through a combination of short and medium-term actions, FAO is providing desperately needed livelihoods assistance so rural communities can continue to produce and access food locally by implementing anticipatory actions ahead of disasters to reduce the impact when they hit, by investing in local people and economies through cash transfers, voucher schemes, and cash for work programs, and by equipping people with tools and resources to provide for themselves, including displaced populations. Agricultural production is possible and effective even in dark times. We know this at FAO because we have done this. With the right support at the right time, small-scale food producers can protect their livelihoods and their communities and stand stronger against future threats.
Good. Thank you, colleagues. That was maybe a bit more FAO on the screen than I wanted there to be on the screen, because really the issue is more about agriculture than about FAO specifically, but hopefully the themes and the messages came through strongly. I'd like to invite Nicolo to come up just to walk through a few slides very quickly on the analysis that I mentioned, and then we're going to open the panel and get into a discussion. Nicolo.
Thank you, Rain. Good afternoon, everyone. So I will give a very brief presentation, just 4 slides to complement what Rain has been saying so far. And I will focus on an analysis of investment flows to food crisis contexts. Starting from this slide, this is an analysis that has been done by the Global Network Against Food Crisis. And if we read this graph from the top to the bottom, at the top we see the increasing amount of people in acute food insecurity, IPC phase 3+, between 2016 and 2021, from 108 million to 193 million. Rain mentioned the figure also for 2022, which reached 222 million. So even a continuing deterioration. If we see the bar chart, we see the humanitarian assistance to food crisis and the development assistance to food crisis. We can see, for instance, interestingly, in 2021, the humanitarian assistance to food crisis, and in that year we don't have yet information on development assistance in this analysis, but if we look at the humanitarian assistance there, it reached a record $9.8 billion US dollars. And it was a significant increase from 2020, which of course clearly tells how donors are reacting to such a deteriorating trend, which is of course fundamental. If we look, however, at the per capita assistance received by the people up there, those amount of people in IPC3+, the per capita figure is decreasing. So if we look at comparing between, for instance, 2018 and 2021, there has been a drop of about 40% in per capita humanitarian assistance to food crisis. Development assistance in food crisis remained quite stable. There was a decrease in 2020 compared to 2019. We don't have yet the figures for 2021. If we look at the breakdown of such assistance, this is the 9.8 billion I was mentioning of humanitarian assistance in 2021. And clearly there is a large amount in going to food assistance, 8.1 billion in 2022, 1.3 billion to nutrition, and 0.4 billion to agriculture and livelihoods. Of course, in the development assistance to food crisis, agriculture gets the largest share, followed by development food assistance, which is mostly through cash, through social protection programs and longer-term type of interventions. So if we look at the humanitarian assistance, and we go back to that time period I was presenting earlier, 2016, 2021, overall, 83% of these assistance went to food assistance, and 13% went to nutrition, and only 4% went to agricultural livelihoods. So from these two slides, clearly the key messages are: one, humanitarian investments, and in general, investments in food crisis, financing flows to food crisis are not keeping pace with the increasing needs and the worrying food insecurity trends. And the second message here is that there is clearly an unbalanced type of assistance when it comes to the support to agricultural livelihoods in food crisis context. However, as Rain said earlier, 80% of the people we're talking about are farmers, are herders, are fishers. And there have been many studies showing that between investing in agricultural livelihoods in emergencies is 5 to 10 times less expensive, and because it gives family the possibility to produce food, to produce their own food at a much lower cost. And just to conclude, we have examples. The 5 to 10 times I was mentioning is documented in a number of studies, and here are just some examples. Rain gave also a few other ones, but here we see Somalia, $144. It's a cropping package which gives the needs for a family for the entire year in terms of cereal requirements worth $960. In Haiti, it costs $5 to vaccinate a cow, and this cow has a value of about $1,000. It produces a gallon of milk per day for the family. Rain mentioned anticipatory actions, actions taken based on early warnings and before hazards have an impact on livelihoods and food security. And we have examples even there of the effectiveness of these interventions in agriculture. In the Horn of Africa, there is the program on desert locusts in 2020, 2021, 230 million invested to prevent the spread of the desert locust outbreak, and it was estimated at about 1.77 billion worth of cereals and milk losses were prevented, with 41.5 million people protected. And the last one is in Mongolia, anticipatory action ahead of ZUD, ahead of cold wave, to protect animals. For every dollar invested in actions like feed distribution, cash, ahead of the event, ahead of the harsh winter, gave $7 in return in terms of avoided disaster impacts. So these are just some examples further strengthening the message that Rain was giving earlier. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolo. So let's move on to the next stage of this side session. If we could cue up the video, please, from Habib, who's unable to join us in person. But again, as I mentioned, Habib Urman Mayad is the Deputy Secretary General of the G7+, and he had some reflections to share by video, and then we'll go to our other panelists.
Greeting from the G7+ Secretariat. At the beginning, I would like to thank the organizers of this important event for inviting me and giving us the opportunity to share our perspective on managing food crisis. By way of introduction, the G7+ is an intergovernmental organization of 20 conflict-affected countries across the regions that include Somalia, South Sudan, DRC, Yemen, Haiti, and Afghanistan, my own country, and others that face the worst food insecurity among other challenges. Our collective mission is to achieve peace, resilience, and stability through national dialogue, better international engagement, grounded on national aspiration and peer learning. Conflict-affected countries have been the host of humanitarian, peacekeeping, and development assistance missions for decades now. Decades of wars in these countries have been the biggest drivers of hunger and humanitarian crisis. And this has been a common feature. On the other hand, these countries have been bestowed with natural potential to be self-sufficient in every aspect, including food sufficiency. But wars undermine these potentials and their resilience to cope with crises, including those caused by nature. However well-intended, the foreign assistance in form of emergency, humanitarian and development aid have not been effective in addressing the needs on sustainable manner. In other words, they have often failed to nurture the potential of prosperity that each country has. As a result, they have continued relying on such assistance. Given the scale and magnitude of crisis we all are facing in the current era, we are forced to find ways to reduce humanitarian needs. That is the only way out of the so-called poly-crisis we are facing. Against this background, I have 3 quick points as our common perspective on how we can manage food crisis in a way that they do not repeat. First, majority of population rely on agriculture as a means of employment in conflict-affected fragile countries. The international community and national actors need to invest in the potential with the aim of making these countries self-sufficient in food production. Therefore, investment in agriculture sector in conflict-affected countries is the most efficient way of reducing needs, building resilience, and pursuing prosperity. This will not only address food insecurity, but will also create means of livelihood, generate employment, and hence resilience. On a long term, this will contribute to sustainable peace, better well-being, and ultimately stability. Second, national means assisted by innovative technology in agriculture is a great enabler to address food insecurities in poor countries. Unfortunately, humanitarian intervention has not benefited from technological development. National ownership is a crucial principle to pursue this. The principle of national ownership includes understanding the context and means that have existed in these countries for centuries. Third and final, the division among humanitarian, peacekeeping, and development actors, accompanied by ad hoc intervention, have caused fragmentation. Recognizing that the conflict is the main reason for hunger, that resilience needs to be sought, then we need to turn the HDP nexus into action. HDP approach can reduce needs if it is operationalized. And in order to do that, we need more flexibility on part of humanitarian development actors. The HDP nexus is a reality that we, the citizens of conflict-affected countries, have lived for decades now. It is in this context that we have joined our forces together with other members, including FAO, WFP, CIPRI, and others to pursue the HDP nexus. I thank you for your attention.
I'd like to thank Mr. Mayad very much. Some important perspectives that go beyond obviously just the focus of our humanitarian conference today, and also the focus of our discussion here on agriculture within humanitarian response, but some really important nuggets and reflections there, not least how we draw on the potential that exists in populations, even populations in a situation of humanitarian crisis. And so helpful to hear those framing comments. I wonder if I could ask Charlotte to join me here. I was going to say on stage. It's a table and two chairs, but thank you very much. We're very, very lucky to have with us Charlotte, who I introduced before, Charlotte Fontaine, who's the thematic expert for food security within DG ECHO. And Charlotte, you've heard the discussions. We've been a little bit provocative at the outset around this too, but based on your current role, based on your vast experience, very keen to hear your thoughts on the extent to which emergency agricultural assistance is maybe underrepresented in the humanitarian response, and should it be better integrated into humanitarian programming and humanitarian funding? Over to you, please.
Thank you. Nice to be here, everyone. So I am based in Dakar, and I'm covering the Western Central Africa region. So I will be using some key example from the field, specifically from this region, I guess. So the first thing that I want to say is that DG ECHO recognized that protection and recovery of livelihood is part of emergency food security assistance. As I hope many of you know, we have a sectoral policy that actually declares exactly that. So from that perspective, from a policy perspective, I don't feel that livelihood, and especially agriculture and food production livelihood, food production related livelihoods are underrepresented from a policy perspective. It is true, based on all the session that we also had yesterday and today, that as a humanitarian donors, we many often have to do harsh choices on where to allocate our funding. And in a situation, as was depicted earlier, where acute and severe food insecurity is on the rise everywhere in the world, we are left with a very difficult task of prioritization on the field. So you will see, I guess many of you are very much familiar with the Humanitarian Implementation Plan, the HIP of ECHO, and you will see that depending on the region and on the country, but usually livelihoods is actually included in our Humanitarian Implementation Plan, in our technical recommendation. Obviously, as you mentioned, the funding level that we can dedicate to it is limited. It is limited because of several factors, and the first one that have been mentioned, I think, is local context. Livelihood in local context can be very efficient, as well as can also, in some other contexts, absolutely not be effective to respond to immediate food consumption needs. So our role as thematic experts is really with our partners, with consultation of our partners on the field, in the country, to try to determine whether or not having includes emergency livelihood support in our strategy is relevant and is possible based on the local context. We do have in Western Central African region some contexts where we actually do invest quite significantly in livelihood. For example, in Central African Republic, we have maybe it's not 50, I don't have the figure, I could have calculated that before coming though. But we actually have a quite significant part of our food security allocated budget to agricultural livelihoods. Because in this context, as you mentioned, because people have access to land, because people are farmers, were farmers before the crisis, are remaining farmers, because there is an overall context that makes it possible for them to farm their land, but the seed system has been completely destroyed by the crisis. Giving seeds to people, as you mentioned, can give them, for the same amount of money, the capacity to cover the need for an overall year, whereas food assistance would cover maybe 1 month or 2 months of food consumption for their households. So in this kind of context, we do try to, as much as possible, and funding allows, we do try to have a twofold approach with emergency food needs that are covered through food assistance, and then a better and more efficient response to food consumption with agricultural support. There are also contexts where this is absolutely not possible. Right now in northern Burkina Faso, we have, I don't know, 16 towns that are completely under blockage, where basically nobody can go in or go out without any access to land, with, I don't know, 1.5 to 2 million people that have been displaced over the past 2 to 3 years. In this kind of context, where the actual assets to support livelihood are not available, it is much more difficult to try to respond to a food crisis at scale with livelihoods. That doesn't mean that we cannot do anything, but at least in terms of efficiency and in terms of trying to address the magnitude and the severity of the needs, livelihoods for a donor like ECHO with a limited budget might not be where we would like to invest for saving lives. So it's really context specific, and I think you mentioned it, and I think it's very critical. Cost efficiency, also you mentioned it, and I use a few examples. And I give you another example where we can do is very limited, not like CAR, where what we can do is much more at scale, but Nigeria, okay? Nigeria, northeast Nigeria, in Borno states, you might be familiar with this context. We have what we call garrison towns. So basically those towns are completely isolated from one another. There are trenches around the towns, and they're basically guarded by the military. 3 to 4 years ago, anyone that was coming in or coming out was basically shot on sight by military officers. Access to land was very, very, very tough. The situation has evolved, and with the situation evolving, we also need to make our humanitarian response strategy evolve. And after the first trenches, well, they did a second trenches. And in that new land that have been kind of being at the disposal of the population, we can do things. And we actually do fund also agricultural support activities for people to actually try to farm this very limited lands that is available. And to be honest, I monitored this project a year ago, and I was not having a very good feeling before going. I was like, okay, it's going to be very, very micro, very minimal in terms of impact that we can get. And I was actually very surprised because the people that we supported through this livelihood agriculture support were actually producing 5 to 6 months of food assistance on a very, very limited land that was put at the disposal by the military. And with a lot of constraints, because you cannot grow sorghum, because sorghum is too high, so the military cannot see if there is an attack coming. So you need to, a lot of technical constraint for agriculture and for trying to achieve a minimum in terms of food consumptions. So there are contexts where we can do and we want to do. And once again, there are contexts where it's much more difficult. I would like to mention that I was happy with the video that you showed. That the way I interpreted this session regarding agriculture was a great A, was a capital A, meaning also livestock, fishery, small food production in general. In the Sahel region in particular, and in the Horn of Africa, it's the same. We are also facing with a lot of pastoralist population that are very often under-assisted under the humanitarian response. And I'm personally convinced that in some context, it is much more efficient to give animal feed as an emergency response to a pastor than to give him food. Because if you give him food, what is he going to do? He is going to sell that on the market, get money to give food for his animals, because his animals, based on his ways of living and his livelihood, is anything he's got. So if he loses that, he loses everything. So we never receive proposal to do these kind of things, never, ever. So we often stand here as a humanitarian donor and why don't you do more in livelihoods? And to be very honest, usually the proposal that we receive in terms of emergency livelihoods usually lack the emergency part of it. I receive proposal to distribute sewing machine in Lake Chad at 16 hours of road from N'Djamena, capital city. And I'm like, okay, for a 12 months project for women that have never sewn anything in their lives. So I think there is also a lack of understanding of what emergency livelihood should be. And the efficiency component of it is really critical. The way that we frame it in our humanitarian implementation plan, in terms of technical recommendation, is that the partner should demonstrate that in the time of the project, which is very short usually with ECHO, especially in food assistance, food security is very rarely more within 12 months. What we want is that the partner can demonstrate that over that short kind of period of time, an actual impact is possible on food consumption. Not food security, because that would be way too ambitious, but at least on immediate and short-term, mid-term food consumption for the households. So I'll leave it to that, and I guess there will be a lot of questions next. But just to say that I don't feel that livelihood is neglected in the humanitarian funding. I think, unfortunately, we have to prioritize, and unfortunately, the evolution of the context, especially the access to the production assets, in many contexts, very much limiting what we can do. But we do need to monitor constantly context and also to adapt our own strategy to be more reactive. And you were talking about windows of opportunity, and also see when we do have windows of opportunity to do more and better. Thank you.
Very good. Charlotte, thank you so much for those reflections, for the recognition, indeed the endorsement that ECHO has, and the inclusion from a policy perspective of emergency livelihoods within humanitarian response. And I think there's really pertinent reflections on how context needs to drive what's appropriate or not, as well as some reflections on areas that maybe don't yet get enough attention, livestock being one of them in certain contexts of pastoral response. So I'm not doing justice to summarize your very good points there, but we'll come back to this afterwards. I want to give a chance also to our colleagues online to make some interventions. And if we could start with Racy Henderson, if you're online. As I mentioned at the outset, Racy is coordinator with the SEEDS project, and we'll come at this now from a slightly different angle. So SEEDS just updated their key tool and handbook, which is a very exciting development. Congratulations, colleagues, for that work. In that you have, amongst other things, also a chapter on anticipatory action. And Racy, I wanted to ask you, as we're looking at how we can work differently in food crisis contexts, if you could speak to the following. Anticipatory actions are increasingly being used as a modality to protect agricultural livelihoods. What are your thoughts about how this anticipatory action modality can be scaled up beyond its current levels? Any thoughts you have on that? Over to you, please, Racy.
Yeah, thank you, Rain, for the question. And just to give a little bit of background on SEEDS, a little bit more, SEEDS is a set of international principles and minimum standards that supports humanitarians or development professionals responding to humanitarian crises, and it helps them to design, to implement, and to evaluate specifically crop-related crisis response. And as Rain mentioned, we did just publish this handbook. It is the newest set of principles that is part of the Humanitarian Standards Partnership. And to talk a little bit, to respond a little bit to your question on anticipatory action, SEEDS principles recommend that implementing organizations anticipate, plan for, and resource preparedness and anticipatory actions. So we see some opportunities for scaling up anticipatory actions, two in particular that are mentioned today. First, ensuring better understanding of the results of crop-related responses and how they affect livelihoods. We know early intervention in agriculture is more cost-effective than late intervention. It's already been mentioned during this session. Unfortunately, as we also know, a big problem with agriculture interventions over the past few decades is that they often arrive at the wrong time. For example, seed support that arrives after the rains have stopped will have little to none of the benefits that Nicolo mentioned earlier. No impact on food security or livelihoods if those seeds that are planted after the rains are not able to grow to maturity, be harvested, and be sold. There's many ifs along that causal chain. So SEEDS supports the principle that appropriate timing of interventions is critical to improving livelihood outcomes of crop-related response. And SEEDS includes decision trees and timing tables for assessing the context to ensure appropriate timing of seed and seed system support, non-seed inputs, and crop-related infrastructure interventions. So second, anticipatory actions can also be scaled up through capacity building for community-level preparedness and rapid response planning. So evidence shows that early warning systems and contingency planning are most effective when developed with local partners, with roles and responsibilities clearly defined and staff that is appropriately trained. Capacity building strengthens the ability of these actors to understand local risks and take action to reduce them. SEEDS advocates for active participation of the affected population in all steps of the response cycle, from assessment and design to implementation and monitoring and evaluation. This approach analyzes and understands vulnerabilities, such as gender, and allows crop-related responses to respond to different and specific household needs and abilities. Documenting and adapting the responses to reflect gender roles and responsibilities will ensure adequate and appropriate support can be provided. So in short, those are a few ways that we see anticipatory action as a critical piece to ensuring that agriculture interventions are necessary, appropriate, and feasible, and that they have an impact on livelihoods. Thank you.
Racy, thank you. Thank you very much for those important reflections on both the timing of interventions and the planning process around how we work differently in context, not least in terms of how we engage local partners and actors in that planning process. I'm going to, as I'm keeping an eye on time and doing a very poor job of moderating today, move quickly on to our final panelist. We're very happy also to have with us Mohamed Douale, as I mentioned before, is the Executive Director of the Rural Agency for Community Development and Assistance, RACIDA, also connected remotely. Mahmoud, if you can hear me, I would really welcome your reflections on this question around protection of agricultural livelihoods as an entry point for Nexus programming. How can greater coordination, collaboration be promoted across humanitarian and development actors to increase the positive synergies that we're looking for? Over to you for your reflections, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Ryan, for giving me this opportunity to give my reflection on this important topic. I work with an organization that works in the Horn of Africa. It's based in Ethiopia and Somalia and in Kenya. So I crisscross the border here and work with communities, mostly agro-pastoralist communities around Somalia and Ethiopia and Kenya. And as you know, recently we had one of the worst droughts in 4 decades that has affected this region. And Nexus is one important programming tool that can promote a greater coordination and collaboration between humanitarian and development actors to increase synergies and funding in order to support agricultural livelihoods. And most often, people focus on lives more than livelihoods in disasters. And so by facilitating and sharing resources and practices and joining funding initiatives, then HDP will be the most important programs that will ensure that agricultural livelihoods are given priorities they deserve. And in addition, it can be used to promote a greater public awareness in the importance of protecting and enhancing agricultural livelihoods that can help to ensure that livelihoods are adequately supported. Most agriculture is one of the most important livelihoods around this area because most of the communities are either pastoralists or small-scale farmers who are used for only subsistence purposes. And during disasters, all that is one of the most forgotten interventions, and people are only focusing more on saving lives in this area. And so if we have the opportunity where we have synergies both in humanitarian development work so that both lives and livelihoods can be saved at the same time in a better coordinated way, then we can save both livelihoods and enhance agricultural livelihood. And this can be done through more on advocacy and information campaigns to raise awareness of the importance of these livelihoods and to encourage more public and the national government, international community support and to protect them for long-term issues. So key of interventions that are most likely important during disasters is to look at how can we have synergies and how can we have both trying to intervene in a short term that can address a recovery or a long-term interventions in agriculture. For example, in most of these areas in northern Kenya and Somalia, there are potential areas where communities can still engage in farming as long as even there are disasters because they have water, they have some rivers. And if such communities are given opportunities to do farming using appropriate technologies, solar pumping, given them appropriate cash transfers immediately after the drought or on during the disaster, these communities can have leverage where they can do the farming at the same time produce when still there's a disaster because there's opportunity and potential areas where they're able to do the farming. So a more resilience and disaster preventions, both recoveries and mitigations and more into climate adaptation programs that are deliberately engaging communities around their livelihoods is the most important programs that can support saving livelihoods. Most of the livestock around these areas die in large numbers because of lack of feeds. And if there are communities along the rivers who are able to produce fodder in time and bank them and or store them so that they are able to save the livestock during disasters and they can fetch it with a good income, that could be an opportunity. And I think one of the panelists was talking about if we could save livestock during the drought and give them feeds would be much more better than giving them food. And this, we find it very appropriate in this region because in some of the areas where livestock feeds were distributed during the disasters, a lot of animals were saved. And those communities can have the animals after the rains and still their livelihoods can flourish. But where there are no interventions which are addressing the livelihoods, particularly in agricultural livelihoods, most of the livestock will perish, the crops, the farmers will leave the farms, and the people will become IDBs and now will be dropouts, and to build their livelihood again will be really a very huge interventions that many of the organizations are not able to resource and take them back to their livelihoods. So on the onsets of disasters, if you can have the Nexus project, the HDP projects that promotes greater coordinations and collaboration between both humanitarian and development actors, and increase funding and also advocacy, this will be really a very important interventions that can save agricultural livelihoods in rural setups, especially in the Horn of Africa. Thank you.
Mohammed, thank you very much for those reflections, those reminders about the options that still exist to, even in vulnerable settings, support agriculture for vulnerable households. And again, the echoes that you've given around some of the context-specific priorities and realities, livestock not least, and beyond the immediate response, how these things can also link nicely with Nexus initiatives longer term. Colleagues, we don't have a lot of time left. I want to just open up and see if there are any comments, reflections anyone would like to share in response to what our panelists have presented on both the opportunities and challenges around managing food crisis a little bit differently with attention to agriculture. Please.
Hi, I'm Fee from Dan Church. I have a question, and maybe it's a little bit inappropriate, but I would like to add agroecology on top of what you've said, and especially the TAPE tool, the tool for agroecology performance evaluation, I think the name is. How do we add an agroecological element to a humanitarian crisis? Because the thing is, these protracted crises, they last for a very, very long time. So while we do all the capacity strengthening, engaging the communities, why not help them go back to nature-based solutions, their own ways of doing it, away from monocropping, away from pesticides and everything else that has been introduced to them by private sector actors and so on? How do we enable a more locally led agroecological approach also in a humanitarian context?
Very good. Thank you for that question. Do we have more microphones at the back? Thank you so much. Let's take a series of questions quickly and see how we can respond to them.
My name is Angelica. I come from Oxfam, and I want to say that one of the recurring topics of these 2 days has been around localization. And yet, during this conversation, we still hear a lot about seed distribution as part of emergencies, as part of emergency responses. So I was wondering if there's any room for going back to, for example, participatory plant breeding, or this type of promoting farmers' seeds varieties that actually are contributing to fighting climate change and ultimately protecting small-scale farmers from food insecurity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Thanks. I'm Dee from Trocra. Can I just add on to Fee's question around agroecology, because I have a constant battle with my colleagues on the development side of the house who are working in agroecology, and we've been talking for years about how bringing this into humanitarian, and they often point out the FAO, steps for agroecology and the 8 steps or 10 steps, which all seem very well and good, but in a humanitarian context like Somalia, really keen to hear, what's your perspective on that? How do we bring that forward? Because I feel like sometimes we're speaking different languages, so it would be really keen to hear from FAO how you...
As keen as we are to hear from you on how we can do it better, but I think there was another question here as well. And then maybe we'll give our panelists a chance to respond after this one.
Yeah, thanks for a fascinating set of presentations. I'm sorry that I came in a little late. I'm Antonia from Alliance 2015. And we don't need any persuading on the need to do this, but I was actually interested to hear perspective from the panelists on how we can make the connection between what you're talking about, enhancing humanitarian investments in agricultural livelihoods, and an overall food systems transformation agenda, because this is also an argument we're constantly trying to make about how we can line up our humanitarian investments with our longer term investments, and how we can ensure that issues like nutrition and food systems transformation are actually, these concerns are the frame in which humanitarian response is happening, both for better responses in real time, but also for more sustainable results in the long term. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you for those excellent questions. So let's do this. If I could maybe go first, Racy, would any of these points you'd like to pick up on in particular, and then I'll go to Mahmoud afterwards, and to Charlotte to see how you would like to try and respond to any of these points or questions. Racy.
Sure. All really great questions. And I was sitting here thinking, I don't have any answers to those questions. And then I realized the basis for seeds, one of the first principle upon which we based our minimum standards. First of all, seeds is a evidence-based document. So we did a year-long research on evidence of what types of assistance have an impact on livelihoods. And in that process, we also identified, seeds is also based on a livelihoods approach. And if you're basing your assistance on specifically identified livelihood objectives, then all of the points that have just been mentioned in question will be addressed as it is relevant to address them. And it may mean in some cases that an agricultural response is not appropriate, that alternative livelihoods need to be considered because of the environmental impact of that agriculture, or because of the likelihood that climate change is going to make agriculture impossible, or because of the fact that the populations are saying we no longer want to do agriculture. So I think the point that I want to make is there needs to be a clear causality between the assistance that we provide in agriculture and the impact that it has on the livelihoods that we are trying to support.
Super. Racy, we don't have a lot of time for responses here as we're coming short, but Mohammed, any reflections that you have based on what you've heard coming as questions from the room?
Thank you very much. Those are all good questions, and I hope equally I had an answer for them. But just to stress on this aspect of humanitarian support for agriculture livelihood during humanitarian disasters, we are looking at how can we include the provision of access, farmers be able to access, inputs, financial assistance to farmers and other agriculture workers and pastoralists during the disaster. How can we prevent their livelihoods not to disappear during a disaster? And then they could include technical advice, insurance for their livestock or their crops, looking at the issues of organizations providing cash or food assistance to help them so that they don't deplete their assets. This could be some of the immediate needs. But finally, I think we have to look at also the long term that will be needed to help the farmers and the pastoralists to build their livelihoods during and after the disaster. And I think Nexus project will be one most important programs that will link and create that coordination and collaboration between the humanitarian development actors. And I think in practice, we used to have what we call linking emergency to recovery and to development. And so how can we do that at the same time so that at least we are able to prevent livelihoods not to disappear or destroy during a disaster, and deliberate interventions that are really trying to save livelihoods, particularly in agriculture, must be incorporated or must be part of the programming during humanitarian assistance. Thank you.
Mahmoud, thank you very much for those reflections as well on how to do response better and how to connect on the Nexus side even more effectively. Charlotte, you've heard the questions, you've heard some of the responses from the panelists. What final thoughts would you have?
So, I think there've been some sessions, some side talks regarding environmental and sorry, I'll start again. ECHO has new guidance on minimum environmental requirements. I don't know if you're all aware about it. If you're not, I'll bring you the news. So, there've been a lot of critical thematic at the agenda within DG ECHO this past 2 to 3 years, and two topics came out here very obviously. So environment and localization, or locally led assistance. Both are paramount when we talk about agricultural livelihood, and I would definitely agree with both of your intervention. ECHO has always, as a donor, tried to, with the little that we do, considering we are usually in very critical emergency context, try to challenge its partner to do as much as possible environmentally responsible support regarding agriculture, meaning locally produce seeds as much as possible, no use of pesticides, agroecological practices, this kind of things. The scale is usually very difficult, not because agroecology in general cannot be at scale, but because we are in contexts that most often the governments are failing. You know, we're in conflict area. There is no one after what we could start to take it over and say, okay, we've started from very small and then we're going to make it bigger through a more sustainable food systems. Just a few examples to respond to your question on localization, and that also, I think, kind of responds to your question. In Central African Republic, INTPA, so International Partnership of the Commission, so my counterpart for development, are funding and have been funding in CAR for many, many years, strengthening of seed systems, locally produced through I don't know how to say that in English, through local agricultural groups, okay, in the community. We have partnered, and I personally agreed technically to fund partners that use those, that do direct purchasing of those seeds, going against all logistical and requirement that we may have, to make sure and support that part of the seeds that is bought with our emergency money is bought to local groups that have been supported through development projects. Still, we have certification of seeds process at government level, etc. So it creates, we cannot go outside of the governmental legislation regarding, seeds in particular, obviously. But there are ways, and we're always trying to explore those ways to have locally based response regarding seeds. The problem is that if you go into an area, everything just been destroyed, you're a humanitarian actor, I don't have the time to found multiplication seeds group, for example. I have, people to feed now as a humanitarian donor. So there is always this balance. But when we get into kind of more protracted level of crisis, that opens more opportunities in terms of locally led response, in terms of agroecological responsible response, and we're always willing to hear what the partner on the ground have to say and have to propose and have to innovate. And we are challenging our partner in many contexts where we feel that we could do more to try to be more innovative in that regard. But just to give a few examples, those obviously are you know, peaks here and there. It's not at scale, but it is possible. Just to tell you, it's possible.
Thank you so much, Racy, Mohammed, and Charlotte for those questions. I know we've run a little bit over time, so maybe just a few final thoughts as we wrap up and let everyone go on their way. Thank you, first of all, for these excellent contributions and participations today. You've seen from the presentation that we face a situation where, in terms of funding, attention to agriculture and emergencies, and here I'm talking about time-sensitive agricultural interventions that are included in humanitarian response plans, that are part of what the food security cluster is prioritizing, are significantly underrepresented in terms of funding, right? So the magic number is 4%, right? In food crisis context, only 4% of the funding that goes into food security goes to agriculture. I think all of us have heard these key messages around we have to be guided by context. We need to know what makes sense, what's appropriate, what's evidence-based, what's feasible in a particular context. I think the message is that we can push the needle significantly more than we currently are in terms of what can be done to support production at the local level, agriculture at the local level, and again, as you were saying, Charlotte, agriculture with a big A. So we're talking about everything here, including livestock, attention to fisheries as well, as a sector which is woefully underrepresented in the response. So there are real opportunities there. And in addition to being cost-effective interventions, if we look at what affected communities are asking for, the 10-year summary of feedback from affected communities that Ground Truth Solutions just put out was compelling to my mind, right? So they talk about communities asking typically for three things. We want peace, we want education for our kids, and we want a means to look after ourselves, we want a livelihoods. Now, the peace element, of course, is not easy for humanitarians to give, but it's interesting what affected communities are asking for versus what we, by instinct, want to be able to provide. And maybe in this space, there are some opportunities to think a little bit differently about what remain humanitarian interventions, but very cost-effective ones too. And I think if we listen to Mohammed's comments as well, in addition to being appropriate, cost-effective, and highly impactful, I think giving the opportunity to collect with development actors as a venue for nexus, practical nexus actions and activities is also a very compelling argument. So again, maybe we were preaching to the converted in the room here on the agriculture side, but really appreciate everyone's time and attention. The compelling realities of the crisis we're facing, I think, impel all of us to work in improved ways and in better ways, and I know that's something we all feel strongly about. Thank you for your time today. Thank you so much.